Welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, thank you for choosing to settle into this quiet little corner. Tonight, we'll open the door to an ancient world, where philosophers walked barefoot, where mythology and philosophy intertwined, and where love was viewed in ways that might surprise you. In ancient Greece, love between two men was neither hidden nor forbidden. On the contrary, it was celebrated as a connection of intellect and soul. And women? In matters of love, they often stood on the sidelines, overlooked, controlled, and rarely heard. Are you ready? Let Sleeping History take you back in time, to uncover the lesser-known sides of love in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, love and sex were not merely emotions or pleasures. They were deeply intertwined with ethics, philosophy, and social order. The Greeks did not view sexuality as something shameful. On the contrary, it was considered a natural part of the life, present in festivals, art, philosophy, and even religion. Physical intimacy was not hidden, but accepted as a necessary aspect of understanding the world, and even of understanding oneself. What's remarkable is that they didn't distinguish between same-sex and opposite-sex love the way modern societies often do. In many cases, love between two men, particularly between an adult man and a youth, was regarded as an ideal model, meant to cultivate moral values and inspire intellectual growth. This kind of love wasn't just physical, it was seen as a bridge to beauty and wisdom. In contrast, love involving women was often viewed as secondary. Women rarely had the freedom to choose whom they loved, and marriage was more of a duty than a romantic bond. Sex within marriage was primarily for producing male heirs and maintaining the family line. To put it gently, in ancient Greece, sex was philosophy. Love was a social structure, and together they shaped a world where desire was not denied, but interpreted through reason. In a place where sunlight cast long shadows over the white stone columns of Athena's temple, where philosophers debated the nature of the soul and existence in the heart of the agora, ancient Greece was also the birthplace of one of the most generous views of love, particularly love between men. No one found it strange when a grown man fell in love with a growing boy. On the contrary, it was regarded as the pinnacle of morality and enlightenment. This relationship had a name, Erastes and Eromenos. The Erastes was the older man, usually someone educated, experienced, a teacher of philosophy, warfare, or poetry. The Eromenos was a young boy, not yet bearded, with bright eyes and a soul blooming like spring daisies. Their bond was a delicate blend of education, admiration, love, and sexuality. And, importantly, it was socially accepted, even celebrated. But not just anyone could participate in a pederastic relationship. Only freeborn male citizens from the upper or middle classes were considered worthy of becoming erastai. The youths chosen as eromenoi typically came from respectable families and were in the process of being trained to become ideal citizens. Their relationship, by Greek standards, was considered part of moral and civic education. By contrast, foreigners, slaves, and especially women were completely excluded from this structure. A slave could not educate or be educated in the context of pederasty, as he had no civic honour, no political standing, and no right to participate in public life. Women, confined within the roles of family and reproduction, were not even mentioned within this concept. This made pederasty not merely about love, but a system that reinforced social hierarchy. It taught young men who held power, who was worthy of receiving knowledge, and who would never be allowed to step into that exclusive circle. A beautiful circle, yet marked with strict boundaries. Sex between men in ancient Greece was not considered deviant. It was only judged when gender roles were reversed. The true man, the Erastes, was expected to be the active partner. If he assumed the passive role, he was seen as weak and dishonourable. In ancient Greek society, strength, control, and intellect were the core values of manhood, even in matters of intimacy. The appeal of pederasty didn't lie in crude desire, but in its philosophical dimension. Plato once wrote in the Symposium, "No one can approach the absolute beauty unless he has first loved a boy." That love, Plato believed, helped humans transcend instinct and move toward beauty, toward ideals, and eternal wisdom. In ancient Greece, literature and art were not merely forms of entertainment or cultural transmission. They served as mirrors reflecting the spirit of unique social relationships, among which pederasty, love between an adult man and an adolescent boy, stood prominently. Unlike modern perceptions, pederasty was seen as a serious component of moral and physical education, openly praised in many contemporary works of art. In poetry, especially the works of Theonis, Anacreon and Pindar, imagery of beautiful youths appears frequently. A boy as lovely as a god, eyes bright like Apollo. These verses did not hide longing. Rather, they cherished such affection as a symbol of spiritual cultivation and aspirational love. In visual art, particularly black figure and red figure pottery of the classical period, scenes depicting affection between Erastes and Eromenos appear regularly, yet they are not overtly pornographic as one might assume. On the contrary, many images carry symbolic and educational significance. The Erastes offering gifts, guiding athletic training, or simply holding hands in ceremonial gestures. These artworks immortalise a time when the bond between teacher and student, old and young, was embedded in a distinct moral framework of the ancient Greeks, a world where love was cultivation, not just carnal desire. The world of love in ancient Greece was not divided along simple gender lines as it often is today. There were no rigid boundaries between heterosexual and homosexual. Instead, love and sexuality were understood through roles, power, and internal morality. A man could be married to a woman, have children, and simultaneously maintain a loving and physical relationship with a young boy, as long as he upheld the masculine role. Of course, when the young boy matured, grew a beard, took a wife, the relationship with his Erastes typically came to an end. But this was not considered tragic. It was seen as a natural cycle, like a student graduating and the teacher quietly stepping back behind the velvet curtain. Looking back from a modern lens, we may find much of this confusing, even unsettling, but in ancient Greek culture, such love was viewed as a way to nurture virtue, transmit knowledge, and shape a generation of citizens who revered beauty and valued reason. It was a world of love not bound by gender, but guided by intellect, admiration, and philosophical thinking. A world where love was not merely an emotion, but a journey toward becoming a better human being. When speaking of ancient Greece, one cannot overlook the symposium, a word that in ancient Greek literally means drinking together. But this was far more than a casual drinking party. It was a complex social ritual, blending wine, philosophical discourse, poetry, musical performances, and at times, sexual encounters. Held in the Andron, a room designated exclusively for men, the symposium was off-limits to respectable women, unless you were a courtesan, a slave, or a musician. Guests would recline on couches, clean-eye. Wine was diluted in large vessels called craters, and then poured into smaller cups. No one was allowed to drink undiluted wine. Doing so was considered barbaric, like the Thracians. But drinking just enough to become slightly inebriated, to open the heart and engage in meaningful conversations, that was an art. In some of the most famous symposiums, philosophers and poets debated not just ethics or the nature of the soul and immortality, but also love, desire, and beauty. One of Plato's greatest works, The Symposium, is precisely a fictional dialogue set during such a banquet featuring Socrates, Aristophanes, Agathon, and others. They argue over the nature of eros. Some claim love is the desire for beauty, others say it's the force that leads us toward knowledge. And in between those lofty discussions there were always laughter, the soft strumming of a lyre, the clinking of cups, and perhaps a glance exchanged between a middle-aged philosopher and a beautiful young boy pouring wine. The symposium was one of the most common settings for pederastic relationships. The boys were chosen for their beauty, trained to pour wine, play music, or sometimes simply to sit there, silent, like living statues. But the gaze of the guests was never silent. They would comment, flirt, compose poetry, or debate where true beauty resides, in the body or in the soul. Although this kind of relationship had its own moral codes within Greek society, in the liberated atmosphere of the symposium, many boundaries seemed to become elastic. Respectable Greek women were not allowed to attend symposiums, but that didn't mean these gatherings lacked female presence. The heterai, often foreign women, educated, skilled in music and capable of engaging in philosophical discussion, were invited not just to sing and dance, but also to be companions in both intellectual and physical pleasures. They were different from slaves, who had no choice. They served wine, cleaned the floors, and were sometimes expected to serve in other ways. In certain symposiums, drunken slaves were deliberately made into objects of mockery, embodying the image of the uncivilized. so that citizens could compare themselves and take pride in their restraint. Music, with the lyre, the aulos, and recited poetry, was an essential element. Sometimes love poems were performed to praise a beautiful youth. At other times, satirical songs were sung, playfully mocking one another with witty remarks. When the wine had seeped into the soul, when philosophy had reached its peak, and when the oil lamps dimmed, the night didn't always end with polite farewells. Sometimes it ended with a tryst in the dark, a whispered enchantment, or the beginning of a new relationship between teacher and student, philosopher and courtesan, Erastes and Eromenos. The symposium, therefore, was more than a party. It was a stage upon which ancient Greek culture shone, where sex was not hidden, but rather a part of dialogue, of aesthetics, of power, and even of knowledge. The word symposium would later come to refer to academic conferences, a meaning that lost the wine, the music, and the midnight smoke. But when we look back at its ancient roots, we see that it was once a place where humans sought truth, through wine, through love, and through the complex relationships between intellect and desire. As in many ancient eras, in the world of classical Greece, especially in Athens, where philosophy and political thought were deeply influential, respectable women were almost entirely absent from discussions about love or sexuality. They lived quietly, hidden behind the walls of the gynekonitis, women's quarters, with the sole duties of bearing children, managing the household, and safeguarding their husband's honour. They were not allowed to attend drinking parties, not allowed to study philosophy, and of course had no right to express affection or choose a partner. In the ancient Greek view, the ideal woman was one no one had heard speak, and no one had seen, invisible and silent. However, in stark contrast to the controlled and secluded image of the wife, there existed another type of woman who was free to speak her mind, to learn, and even to debate with philosophers, the hetairai, the high-class courtesans. These women were not simply prostitutes, but intellectual companions to statesmen, artists, and scholars. Some famous hetairai, like Aspasia, the lover of Pericles, were even believed to have influenced Athenian politics and reportedly taught rhetoric to Socrates. The world of sexuality in ancient Greece was clearly divided into three roles: the lawful wife, to bear legitimate children and maintain the family line; the hetairai, to converse, love, and share the soul; sex slaves, to satisfy physical desire with no legal status. This reveals how ancient Greek society operated under a strict division of gender and class. Women were not defined by their individual qualities, but by the roles they played in men's lives. If they were wives, they were controlled. If they were courtesans, they might be respected, but never allowed to become a legitimate wife. If they were slaves, they had no personhood at all. Women were not allowed to choose love, much less be active agents in it. Everything surrounding sexuality was a male privilege, and only for those men deemed worthy. It was a system of morality deeply rooted in inequality, yet cloaked in the language of aesthetics, philosophy, and art. Notably, when we look at ancient literature, from Homer's epics to Euripides' tragedies, women only appear in clear focus when they are suffering, rebelling, or tragic. Women who loved or desired freedom, like Medea, Antigone, or Helen, were often punished or turned into symbols of chaos. Only within the realms of courtesanship or mythology were women allowed to breathe. Courtesans could voice their thoughts. Goddesses could pursue love. But real women, especially wives, were only acknowledged for their role in bearing children and keeping the household. This worldview influenced not only daily life, but was deeply embedded in law. In Athens, a man could have relations with courtesans, slaves, or even young boys without breaking the law. But if a wife committed adultery, it was a serious offence, punishable by divorce or legal consequences. In other words, women were the property of the household, tools of reproduction, symbols of male honour. They were bound not only by moral codes, but also by political and social institutions. From a modern perspective, this seems deeply unjust. Yet in that time, the system was considered reasonable, even ideal. As Plato once wrote, women should not participate in public life because their emotions are too soft. The irony is that in a society which so highly valued intellect, women, half the population, were excluded from the very game. They existed in daily life as shadows, unless they stepped outside the norms, becoming courtesans, myths, or tragedies. In ancient Greek society, sex was not merely a physical act or a personal expression of affection. it was also a tool to demonstrate status, power, and social order. Sexual relationships, who was allowed to have them, with whom, and in what way, were tightly regulated by the class system. In this world, sex was a privilege for some and an imposition upon others. At the top of the social pyramid stood the aristocracy, wealthy men with political power, property, and education. For them, sex was not only a pleasure, but also a display of status. An aristocratic citizen could own multiple sexual slaves, frequent high-class courtesans, and even engage in same-sex relationships with adolescent boys without facing social condemnation. In the famous symposia, gatherings where wine, philosophy, and pleasure intertwined, elite men could freely express their desires and affections. Sexual relations were a natural part of social interaction. But not everyone was allowed into the symposium room. Only free men of higher social rank were granted this honour. In contrast, lower-class men, such as farmers and craftsmen, had far more restricted sexual lives. They could not afford the services of expensive courtesans, let alone the intellectual companionship of learned hetairai. For them, the most accessible sexual partners were often slaves, male or female, individuals who had no right to refuse. For a poor man, marriage was often the ultimate goal, but marriage did not necessarily come with sexual authority. His wife, a free woman, lived under a strict system of control. Even within the household, the husband's sexual autonomy was limited, as laws and customs placed the wife under the supervision of her husband's family. While men were encouraged to live freely and indulgently before marriage, free women, those born into citizen families, were subject to strict control. They were raised to become wives and mothers, not lovers. Premarital sex was considered taboo for women, and female adultery was seen as a much graver offence than that of men. Women had no right to choose their partners or husbands. Marriage was typically arranged between families. Once married, a woman was confined to the home, rarely allowed to go outside, and entirely dependent on her husband. In the eyes of society, sex with one's husband was a duty, not a choice. If a woman was raped, legal protection was almost non-existent, as family honour was considered more important than her personal safety. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, and no group endured greater sexual injustice. Both male and female slaves had no right to refuse sexual relations with their masters. They were regarded as living property, part of a man's personal assets like oxen or ships. Female slaves were often forced to work in brothels or serve sexually within aristocratic households. They were not allowed to legally marry, could not keep their children if the master demanded an abortion or chose to sell the child. Male slaves were not exempt from abuse. Many were raped by their masters or exploited at drinking parties. Sex with a slave was not considered adultery, as society did not recognize slaves as complete human beings. As a result, there were no legal protections against sexual abuse, and any attempt at resistance was easily crushed. In ancient Greek society, sex was not a private matter but a public expression of status and power. The rich had the right to love whomever they wanted, even to own others. The poor lived within the limits of their financial and social standing. Women were bound by expectations of chastity, while slaves were treated as tools for pleasure. This sexual inequality was not accidental. It was a carefully constructed part of the social system. It served to protect aristocratic male power, maintain family order, and rationalize the exploitation of slaves. By controlling sexuality, the ancient Greeks controlled the very soul of a person. In ancient Greece, marriage was not about love. It was a contract, cold, calculated, and clearly transactional. The bride's father would negotiate with the groom's family regarding the dowry, the suitability of the match between the two households, and of course, the girl's potential to bear children. An ideal bride didn't need to be intelligent or talkative. She only needed to be obedient, a virgin, and capable of producing sons. And love? It had no place in the equation. In ancient Greek marriage, especially in Athens, the union was between two oikoi, households, not two hearts. The wife's role was to manage the household and bear legitimate children, especially sons to carry on the family line. Legally, only children born from a marriage between a male and female citizen had the right to citizenship. A wife might not even meet her husband until the wedding day. After the ceremony, which included offerings to the goddess Hera and a bridal procession to the groom's house, she would live her entire life in the Zynoceum, the women's quarters, completely separated from the outside world. It was a subtle imprisonment, masked as honour. Women weren't confined because they were weak or needed protection. They were locked away, denied education, forbidden to speak to unrelated men, all for one reason: to ensure that the child she gave birth to was truly her husband's legitimate heir. In a society where all property, from land and power to family honour, was transmitted through the male bloodline, nothing was more important than guaranteeing that the son who inherited was authentic, not illegitimate. And the simplest way to do that? Control women. Virginity in Athens wasn't some sacred symbol of purity. It was the security system of the family line. A fragile hymen carried the entire weight of a family's honour. There was no such thing as a virginity test in ancient Greece, unlike in some later cultures. Instead, society created a kind of soft prison. A girl was not allowed to go outside, not allowed to study much, not allowed to speak freely, and not allowed to dream. Once married, she was locked behind closed doors, only permitted to leave the house with an escort, typically a slave or a nursemaid. Interestingly, Greek men, especially from the citizen class, had no issue with extramarital sex, so long as it was them doing it. They were allowed to sleep with courtesans, have male lovers, or even purchase sex from slaves without being seen as immoral. But if a wife was unfaithful, the consequences were severe. Not just divorce, but also public shame upon her entire family. There's a painful paradox in ancient Greek society. Women were expected to be chaste, while men were not only allowed but encouraged to explore sexually. In Aristophanes' comedies or Plato's dialogues, we see hints, sometimes humorous, about men being bored of their wives, because wives weren't as interesting as hetaerai or handsome young boys. However, if a man had sexual relations with a married woman, it was not merely immoral, but a legal offence. In Athenian law, this act was known as moicheia, often translated as adultery, but it carried very different implications from our modern understanding. According to the laws of Draco and later Solon, if a man was caught in the act of adultery with another man's wife, the husband or the wife's male relatives had the legal right to kill him on the spot, without being charged with murder. If the adulterer wasn't killed, he could face castration as a humiliating punishment that stripped him of his masculinity. Public shaming, being paraded naked through the streets or locked in a cage to be mocked by the crowd, fines or lawsuits, depending on the circumstances. What's striking is that the real victim of adultery was not considered to be the woman, but the husband, whose honour had been violated. While men had many escape routes, for women, adultery was nearly unforgivable. A woman caught cheating would immediately face expulsion from the household, banishment from public religious rituals which were central to civic life, loss of custody and inheritance rights for her children, since the child would be suspected of not being pure-blooded. In fact, if a man continued to live with an adulterous wife, he could be stripped of his citizenship for failing to protect the honour of his household. The woman not only lost her honour, but could become the target of public attack, gossip, and total social isolation. This may sound strange from a modern perspective, but in ancient Greek society, adultery was not viewed as a private family matter, but rather as a disruption of public order. A citizen could not maintain his social standing if he failed to control the women in his household. The so-called honour of citizenship wasn't just about going to war or paying taxes, it also meant protecting the purity of one's bloodline. In a society where only legitimate children born within marriage were granted citizenship, any suspicion of illegitimacy threatened inheritance rights and the very structure of society. Although wives had no real authority within the household, ancient Greek society did allow for divorce, and both sides had the right to initiate it. But in practice, the power heavily favoured the husband. A husband could unilaterally expel his wife by simply informing her family and filing a declaration with a magistrate. A wife could also seek divorce, but only with legal support from a male guardian, usually her father or brother. Without the backing of a man, a woman's voice held no legal weight in the male-dominated court system. Even if she succeeded in obtaining a divorce, the wife would be denied custody of her children and was usually forced to return to her parental home, living in a state of near abandonment. Ironically, romantic love, something we now associate so closely with marriage, was often found outside of marriage in ancient Greek society. Poets like Sappho wrote about love between women, while male poets such as Anacreon and Theognis praised the affection between men and young boys. And what about women? They had no freedom to love. were not educated like men, and spent their lives under strict surveillance. Any voluntary relationships they might have had were often seen as a threat to the social order. Looking at the institution of marriage and divorce, one thing becomes clear. Sexuality in ancient Greek society was not simply a private matter, it was a matter of power, status, and societal order. Men, especially free male citizens, were given the freedom to choose, control, and indulge. Women, whether wives, slaves, or courtesans, were always the ones being controlled. While a woman could, in theory, initiate a divorce, it was as rare and fleeting as a cool breeze during an Athenian summer. The ancient Greeks were far from naive or pure in their sexual lives, contrary to what many might imagine. On the contrary, they possessed a rich body of folk knowledge and traditional medicine related to birth control, love enchantments, and even magical aphrodisiacs. Silphium was a plant native to Cyrene, modern-day Libya, considered a contraceptive wonder drug in the ancient world. The Greeks and Romans valued it so highly that they even minted coins with its image. In the writings of Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, silphium was described as a multi-purpose remedy, treating digestive issues, relieving menstrual pain, and in stronger doses, inducing early abortions. Women could drink the plant's resin or use it as a vaginal wash to prevent pregnancy. Silphium was harvested so heavily that it became extinct by the 1st century BCE, leaving a noticeable void in ancient medical practices. Not everyone could afford silphium, so ordinary people used more accessible ingredients: honey, pine resin, acacia gum, and especially olive oil, which was a household staple in Greek homes. Women would apply these mixtures into the vagina before intercourse, forming a natural barrier or creating an inhospitable environment for sperm. Some sources suggest that acacia gum had mildly acidic properties, similar to modern spermicides. Additionally, there are records of inserting cloth soaked in medicinal substances deep into the vagina, essentially a primitive barrier method, simple yet relatively effective. Not only did the ancient Greeks practice birth control, they also actively engaged in love enchantments, through charms, magic, and strange aromatic potions. On lead tablets called katadesmoi, people would inscribe prayers to underworld deities like Hecate or Hermes, asking them to make the desired person fall in love, or even suffer from longing. These charms were often buried in cemeteries, hidden under beds, or thrown into wells, places believed to be gateways to the underworld. In addition, folk witches, often elderly women living on the margins of society, could concoct love potions made from herbs, scents, or even animal blood. These recipes were rarely written down but passed on orally. The boundary between medicine and magic in ancient Greece was blurry at best. Physicians like Soranus, 2nd century CE, wrote in considerable detail about contraceptive methods, including herbal drinks, hot baths, and more, reflecting the level of experimentation and ingenuity among ancient practitioners. Yet, one truth stands out. Ancient women were often proactive in protecting their bodies. Even within a patriarchal society, they sought ways to control reproduction, not just to avoid consequences, but to retain autonomy in relationships where they often had little power. It may sound modern, but family planning has existed for thousands of years, only it came in the form of scents, leaves, and curses. In a society where childbirth could impact one's reputation, property, and even the survival of an entire lineage, controlling pregnancy wasn't just a personal matter, it was a strategic life decision. The ancient Greeks may not have had pregnancy tests, condoms, or pharmacies, but they had knowledge, creativity, and sometimes a little magic. Just like in ancient Egypt, for the ancient Greeks, sexuality was not a taboo to be hidden or suppressed. It was simply a part of life, like eating, dressing, singing, or philosophizing. And art was the medium that most truthfully reflected the soul of a culture. One of the most common forms used to depict sexual imagery was through pottery. Wine-mixing bowls, crater, drinking cups, kylix, and small perfume jars, arabalos, were all hand-painted with black or red figure techniques. And if you thought these were just for holding liquids, think again. These vessels offered a visual world, scenes of a man courting a young boy, couples making love in various positions, or even passionate orgies. Especially during symposia, the all-male drinking parties of Greek society. Such imagery wasn't just accepted, it became a catalyst for conversation. As men drank, they would look at erotic scenes painted on their wine cups while discussing ethics, love, beauty, and desire. Imagine it as a kind of ancient talk show where intellect and lust merged freely. Greek sculpture also played a major role in spreading images of the nude body. However, the key distinction lies here. Men were depicted fully exposed, showcasing muscular physiques and powerful stances, symbols of idealized masculinity. Today, we use the word pornography, which carries negative connotations, suggesting obscenity, vulgarity, and prohibition. But in ancient Greece, the root word pornographos literally meant writing about courtesans, without the derogatory meaning it has acquired over time. The sexual images on Greek pottery were not created merely for arousal, but as a form of visual education, to teach about gender roles, romantic traditions, social norms, philosophies of life, and even everyday comedy. Some archaeologists believe that these erotic scenes helped Greek adolescents learn about sexuality and social relationships before reaching adulthood. They were visual comics, a kind of picture-based textbook, free of hypocrisy and far from dry moral instruction. In the worldview of the ancient Greeks, sex was not separate from religion, art, or philosophy. The god of love, Eros, and the goddess of beauty, Aphrodite, were worshipped not only for their appearance, but for their power to influence all human behaviour. The philosopher Plato even wrote an entire work titled Symposium, exploring the different kinds of love, where sexual desire was not condemned, but analysed as a great philosophical force capable of leading the soul closer to pure beauty. In Greek culture, therefore, sexuality was not a source of shame. Quite the opposite. It was something to be contemplated, understood, and appreciated as an essential part of civilized life. The ancient Greek world had no blacked-out screens, no 18-plus warnings, no forbidden zones. Instead, there were bold, aesthetic, and symbolic images that helped people live in harmony between instinct and intellect. And in that world, the art of sex was not pornography. It was culture. Sex was not only expressed through images, it was also embedded in mythology. In the world of ancient Greece, where every mountain peak could be the dwelling of a god, and every breeze was believed to be stirred by the invisible hand of Olympus, sexuality was not viewed as base or sinful. On the contrary, it was something sacred, a mystical bond linking humans, gods, and nature. At the heart of all symbols of love in Greek mythology stands Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and carnal desire. She was not only worshipped as a divine giver of love, but also revered as the patroness of sensuality and pleasure. No one in ancient Greece ever asked, "Is sex sacred?" because the answer was self-evident in every nude statue of Aphrodite, in every religious ritual evoking the divine union of celestial beings. Notably, in many regions, especially Corinth and Kythera, Aphrodite was worshipped in the form of Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of all the people, representing physical love, not just idealized affection. In temples dedicated to her, there even existed the practice of sacred prostitution, where women engaged in sex as part of religious rites honoring the goddess. If Aphrodite embodied sensual elegance and allure, then Dionysus, the god of wine, festivals, and divine madness, represented a wild, liberated form of sexuality. He was the deity of ecstasy, indulgence, and the breaking of social boundaries. The annual Dionysia festivals held in Athens and many other cities were vivid proof that the ancient Greeks did not treat sex as something to be hidden. During these festivals, people dressed as half-human, half-goat figures, like Pan or the satyrs, danced, sang, and participated in performances symbolizing sexual acts, expressing the deep connection between human beings and their animal nature, between the natural world and primal instinct. Giant phalluses were paraded through the streets, erotic dances were performed openly, and the entire community, from the old to the young, participated. Not for the sake of pornography, but to celebrate life, to invoke fertility, good harvests, favourable weather, and abundant reproduction. This was an ancient form of fertility worship, deeply connected to cosmic cycles and rebirth. Another remarkable figure was Pan, the half-man, half-goat god of the wilderness, who embodied unrestrained sexual instinct. Pan felt no shame in expressing desire. He played his flute, chased after goddesses and forest nymphs, and became a symbol of nature's surging vitality. In ancient Greece, sexuality was inseparable from spirituality. From mythological tales of Zeus transforming himself to seduce mortals, to religious rites reenacting sacred unions, all reflected a unique worldview. Sex was a bridge between humanity and the cosmos. There was no strict boundary between body and soul, instinct and intellect. The Greeks believed that emotion and pleasure were part of the divine experience. This wasn't just moral permissiveness. It was a profound, ancient insight into the relationship between life and the sacred. In the philosophy of Plato, physical love was the first rung on the ladder toward intellectual and soulful love. Meanwhile, for ordinary people, every sexual act, whether within or outside of marriage, could be considered sacred if tied to religion, festivals, or symbolic meaning. It's no coincidence that the ancient Greeks left behind countless sexual images in pottery, sculpture, literature, and mythology. They did not see sex as something to be hidden, but as an intrinsic part of human and divine nature. Fertility festivals, statues of Pan roaming the forest, or Aphrodite rising from the sea foam, all together painted a world where desire was not condemned but understood and revered. In the ancient Greek cosmos, sex was not merely an act, it was a journey of connection, where humans not only found pleasure but also discovered the divine within themselves. Beauty secrets of ancient Greece. In a land where ivory-white marble columns rose under the brilliant Mediterranean sun, where each morning echoed with hymns praying for Aphrodite's blessings, the ancient Greeks didn't merely live among beauty, they lived for beauty. To them, beauty wasn't frivolous or superficial. It was a reflection of harmony, cosmic order, and a vital element of the ideal known as kalokagathia, the union of beauty, kalos, and virtue, agathos. In a world of smooth marble statues and demigods with flawless skin, the ancient Greeks, especially noble women, developed meticulous beauty rituals using only what nature provided. They had no anti-aging serums, no retinol, AHA, or SPF 50. Yet they cared for themselves with the belief that the body was a gift from the gods, and beauty was a way to honour life itself. In ancient Greek society, bathing was not merely a hygienic act. It held deep ritualistic and cultural meaning. It was an essential step before any significant event, from worship and sexual encounters to banquets or gatherings at temples and gymnasiums. The Greeks believed that a clean body was not only aesthetically pleasing, but also a sign of harmony with nature and the gods, especially Apollo, god of light and purity, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. In major city-states like Athens and Sparta, bathing was practiced regularly at public bathhouses, which featured surprisingly advanced plumbing systems for their time. You could find cold baths, hot baths, and even steam rooms, early models of the complex bathing culture that the Romans would later expand. These public bathhouses weren't just places to cleanse the body. They were also social spaces, where citizens talked politics, relaxed after training, or simply enjoyed each other's company. The nobility and wealthier classes often had private bath areas within their homes, where servants would pour water over their masters using distinctive two-handled ceramic jugs called hydria. Water was drawn from deep wells or the city's early plumbing systems and was typically warmed by boiling it in bronze or terracotta pots. On special occasions, they would add essential oils or herbs to the bath water to ward off evil spirits, promote health, or simply make the skin more fragrant and supple. The Greeks did not use soap as we do today, but they had an equally effective cleansing method. They would rub olive oil all over their bodies and then use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape off the oil along with dirt, sweat, and dead skin cells. This wasn't just a method for cleaning the skin, it was seen as a way to purge worldliness, preparing the body to meet the divine or a lover. Olive oil not only cleaned but also moisturized and protected the skin from the harsh Mediterranean sun. In addition to olive oil, they might use pine resin, clay, or wood ash, mixed with water as a form of natural body wash. For women in particular, post-bath skincare was given special attention. Once the skin was clean and dry, they would often apply perfume or fragrant oils, homemade from tree resins, jasmine, cinnamon, or lavender. These scents not only made them more attractive to the opposite sex, but were also regarded as the fragrance of purity, pleasing to the gods. In fact, some young women, before entering the temple of Aphrodite, would bathe in sacred spring water and anoint themselves with perfume as a ritual of devotion. Another important aspect of beauty was full body hair removal, especially for noble women and courtesans. Smooth skin was seen as a symbol of purity, youth, and sensual appeal. Common methods included rubbing the skin with pumice stone, plucking with bronze tweezers, or using a heated sugar and lemon mixture, much like modern-day waxing. Some historical records also mention mixtures of tree resin and fine ash used for depilation, which left the skin smooth and radiant under the sun. Whether rich or poor, the ancient Greeks placed great importance on keeping the body clean, fragrant, and in harmony. They believed the body was a gift from the gods, especially the human form, which was regarded as a perfect work of art. Thus, maintaining and honouring the body through bathing and skincare was an essential part of both religious life and aesthetic values. Some temples, particularly those dedicated to the goddess of love, featured sacred basins, lustral basins, used for ritual purification before worship or sacrifice. During major festivals like the Panathenaea or Anthesteria, participants were expected to bathe thoroughly before joining processions. For athletes competing in the Olympic Games, bathing and anointing themselves with oil was a mandatory ritual, symbolizing their reverence for Zeus, the king of the gods. To the ancient Greeks, bathing was not merely a hygienic routine, but the beginning of all sacred aesthetic and social activities. It was a moment when one set aside the dust of daily life, shed the ordinary self, and returned to a pure, original state, where body and soul were cleansed and prepared for new experiences, whether it be a wine banquet, a romantic encounter, or a prayer sent toward the distant peak of Mount Olympus. After cleansing themselves thoroughly with cool water, olive oil, and estrigil, ancient Greeks, especially noble women, entered the next stage of skincare. To them, skin wasn't just an aesthetic feature, but a symbol of purity, harmony, and divine connection. A beautiful woman was not merely attractive in the face, but one whose skin was smooth, fragrant, and radiant, as if illuminated by the divine light of Apollo. The dry Mediterranean climate, salty breezes, and sandy wind made skincare a necessity. Greeks understood the harshness of their environment and developed methods to maintain healthy, supple skin. They used plant oils, olive oil, almond oil, castor oil, sesame oil, not only to cleanse but to moisturize deeply and protect against UV exposure. Homemade creams were crafted from mixtures of oil and beeswax, often scented with extracts of jasmine, violet, thyme, resin, or myrrh. The affluent could afford exotic imports like labdanum, a resin harvested from rock rose plants that provided a rich, sensual fragrance ideal for creating night creams. One well-known recipe was a whitening facial mask made from honey, goat's milk, and white clay. Honey offered mild antibacterial and soothing effects. Goat milk provided natural lactic acid for gentle exfoliation, and white clay from melos or lemnos absorbed excess oil and tightened pores. Greek noblewomen would apply this mask in the early morning or late afternoon, letting it dry under gentle sea breezes or sun before rinsing it off with spring water, believing it nourished the skin as one nourishes the soul. Among the elite, perfuming the body was considered a high beauty ritual, transforming one's body into a living temple of Aphrodite. They applied precious oils over the entire body, from forehead to feet, usually after bathing and before dressing or leaving the house. A truly beautiful woman captivated not just by her looks, but also by the way her fragrance softly surrounded her, like dewy mist. Scents such as rose, myrrh, or cinnamon were believed to be pleasing to the gods when women visited temples to pray. They also paid special attention to rough skin areas, elbows, knees, and especially heel cursor, that become dry or calloused from walking barefoot or wearing thin sandals. Folk medical advice recommended a cream made from almond oil and beeswax with light pumice massage to maintain soft heels. In ancient Greek aesthetics, soft feet were a mark of cleanliness, decorum, and womanly dignity. In their view, the ideal woman's skin was pale, smooth, and radiant, in contrast to the tanned skin of labourers. Noble women avoided sun exposure indoors or wore thin scarves when venturing outside. Some accounts mention the use of white lead powder or chalk to lighten the face, though long-term use could cause skin poisoning, and Hippocratic physicians warned against it. A famous line attributed to Sappho captures this ideal. A woman should smell of Aphrodite's fragrance and have skin soft like a lotus petal. This proverb reflects ancient Greek standards, not just of beauty, but the sanctity linked to appearance, skin, and inner divinity. Women were seen as embodiments of life and fertility, so caring for the skin was also a way to preserve the goddess energy within, and in every era, women have known how to use cosmetics, crafted from the materials available in their time. In ancient thinking, the face was the seat of the soul, and makeup was a sacred act, a way to honour the beauty bestowed by the gods, while also serving as protection against evil spirits, illness, and the erosion of time. One of the most essential cosmetic items was kohl, a black powder made from lead ore, galena, used to line the eyes. Both women and men in ancient Greece used kohl to emphasize and enlarge the eyes, but also to protect them from the sun's glare, a function inherited from ancient Egyptian traditions. They believed that dark eye lines mimicked the shape of the Eye of Horus, a protective symbol that warded off evil spirits and disease. Though Egyptian in origin, this symbol was revered and adopted by the Greek aristocracy in daily life. Beyond the black outline, ancient Greeks coloured their eyelids with natural minerals, black from galena, green from finely ground malachite, and especially violet or pale pink shades achieved by crushing amethyst, a purple quartz believed to symbolise purity and self-restraint. The eyes were painted not only for seduction, but to reflect the soul, intellect and wisdom, ideals associated with Athena, the goddess of reason and beauty. Rouge and lipstick were also indispensable. The Greeks used red clay, hematite powder, an iron oxide, or madder root extract to tint the cheeks and lips with a soft rosy hue. To make the colour last longer, they mixed the dyes with animal fat, usually pork lard or goose fat. However, in some cases, women used lead salts or red lead oxide to achieve a deeper red. Unfortunately, these substances were toxic. Many aristocratic women unknowingly suffered lead poisoning from their cosmetics, resulting in greyish skin, sores or hair loss, a deadly secret behind the beauty of the age. Eyebrows were given special attention. In ancient Greek aesthetics, arched, thick and symmetrical brows represented harmony and ideal proportions, a concept rooted in the Greek philosophy of the golden ratio. To shape and define their brows, people used crushed charcoal, black lead powder, or mixtures of ash and oil, often extending the brow line toward the temples. Some sources even mention that women used goat hair, or real human hair, pasted onto the face to create seamless, false eyebrows. Notably, both men and women in Greece could wear makeup, especially during religious festivals, banquets, symposia, or theatrical performances. However, owning a personal makeup set was a privilege reserved for the wealthy. Powder boxes, lipstick jars, and kohl vessels were often made from precious wood, bronze or alabaster, intricately carved with depictions of gods like Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, Artemis, goddess of purity, or even Medusa, symbolizing dangerous allure and feminine power. In aristocratic households, makeup rituals were often performed with the help of female slaves or attendants, specifically tasked with beauty duties. These attendants prepared cosmetics, mixed pastes, ground stones, or crushed powders as needed. Some special cosmetics were made from rare ingredients imported from Egypt, Persia, or India, making makeup not only a beauty tool, but a status symbol. The Greeks did not view makeup as artificial or vain, in the way it is sometimes judged in modern thought. On the contrary, makeup was seen as a way to honour the divine beauty granted by the gods. Some philosophers even believe that to wear makeup is to prepare the face for meeting the gods. So, beauty was not only about earthly attraction, it was a means for the divine to recognise you in the afterlife. When speaking of cosmetics, one cannot overlook hair, which in ancient Greece was not merely for beauty as in modern times, but a reflection of status, gender, virtue and class. Hair was seen as the natural crown of an individual, especially for women, and hair care and styling were considered essential parts of both beauty rituals and religious offerings to the gods. Unlike the hot, dry climate of Egypt that often compelled men to shave their heads, the Greeks lived in the milder Mediterranean climate, so hair loss or baldness was less common. However, concerns over thinning or falling hair still existed, particularly among the upper classes, where a thick, shiny, neatly braided or elaborately curled hairstyle was a symbol of wealth and refinement. Washing the hair was considered a part of purification rituals. The Greeks didn't have liquid soap or shampoo like today. Instead, they cleaned their scalp using a mixture of white clay, ash water and aromatic oils. Clay helped absorb oil, ash water acted as a mild alkali to remove dirt, and essential oils, such as lavender, verbena or rosemary oil, left a soft and pleasant fragrance after washing. For hair nourishment, they used natural plant oils like castor oil, olive oil or dateseed oil, applied directly to the hair to prevent dryness, maintain softness, improve texture, and preserve shine. Women often applied oil at night before sleeping, then brushed their hair with wooden combs or animal horn combs to distribute the oil evenly. Hairstyles in ancient Greece were highly varied and evolved over time. Aristocratic women typically wore long hair, but never let it down in public. Doing so was considered too provocative or lacking in self-control. Instead, hair was braided into small plaits, twisted into curls, or woven into high buns, sometimes styled in multiple loops around the head, in what was known as the melon coiffure. One popular style was the korimbos, a bun placed at the back of the head and secured with ribbons. Another was the low ponytail, fastened with bronze pins, wooden clips, or thin gold bands. Wealthier women decorated their hairstyles with gold hairpins, gemstones, or pearls, not only as ornaments but also as symbols of femininity. In some myths, removing a woman's hairpin was seen as a sign of seduction or a prelude to intimacy. The Greeks also had no hesitation in using wigs, especially in old age or when natural hair had thinned. Wigs were made from human hair, wool, or flax fibres, and dyed brown, black, or blonde as desired. Voluminous curly wigs or those composed of intricate braids were particularly popular. Not only did they enhance elegance, but they also made the head feel lighter and cooler during hot days. For men, hair care was equally important, particularly the beard. A Greek man with a well-trimmed beard and neatly cut hair was seen as the epitome of masculinity, self-control, and intellect. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Pythagoras all wore long, carefully groomed beards as an expression of their inner contemplative lives. However, not everyone had freedom in how they wore their hair. Slaves were often forced to cut their hair short or shave their heads to clearly distinguish them from free citizens. Conversely, unmarried young women usually wore long hair that flowed softly down their backs, a sign of virginity and purity. Upon marriage, their hair would be tied up and covered with a veil, marking a new chapter in a woman's life. From mythology to daily life, hair was closely associated with divine figures. Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, was often depicted with long, flowing curls, falling naturally like waves of the sea. Meanwhile, Artemis, symbol of independence and wild nature, wore her hair in a high, simple bun, full of personality. These images not only influenced sculpture and art, but also set aesthetic ideals for women of the time. To the ancient Greeks, hair was far more than ornamentation. It was a symbol of inner character, social standing, and the connection between humans and the divine. As an ancient proverb said, "Hair is a woman's crown. Whether real or false, it must be as glorious as a goddess's." Clothing is a distinctive symbol of each era, and the attire of ancient Greece carried a unique beauty, both simple and refined, reflecting the aesthetic mindset and lifestyle of its people. For the ancient Greeks, clothing was not merely a means of covering the body or keeping warm, but an extension of divine essence, especially for women. In a culture that revered beauty, form, and harmony, garments were designed to reveal the human figure naturally yet gracefully, sensual yet dignified. The most common materials were wool and linen. Wool, woven from sheep's fleece, retained heat well and was suited for winter, while light linen made from flax was favoured in summer. The wealthy owned finely woven, thick fabrics dyed with expensive pigments, whereas common folk wore simple, undyed garments, or ones in basic tones like white, beige, or pale brown. Women's clothing typically consisted of two main layers: the chiton, a long tunic-like dress, and the himation, an outer cloak. The chiton could reach down to the ankles and was sometimes fastened at the shoulders with pins, creating graceful pleats that hugged the body. For aristocratic women, the cut and folds were carefully designed to flatter the figure, especially the waist, shoulders, and neckline. Interestingly, Greek women did not wear undergarments as we know them today. They wore as if wearing nothing, because modesty was not defined by concealment, but by graceful demeanour, soft steps, and the reverent care of their body as a living temple. Pure white garments symbolised purity and closeness to the goddesses, especially Athena and Artemis. In certain festivals or religious ceremonies, women even wore sheer garments as a way of embodying the divine protectresses of legend. Though the designs were simple, Greek women placed great importance on jewellery. It was their way of expressing social status, wealth, and personal taste. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, rings, hairpins, and headbands were intricately crafted from gold, silver, gemstones, or coloured glass. These items were not only decorative but also spiritual, serving as amulets, symbols of luck, or silent prayers to the gods. A particularly popular item was the broad collar necklace, featuring multiple layers of colourful beads, often inspired by motifs from nature and mythology. In sculptures and reliefs, one often sees women adorned with golden headbands, hair pinned with floral clips, and a gitton flowing like a waterfall, creating a beauty both earthly and divine. No art of dressing would be complete without fragrance. While they didn't use perfume in the modern sense, Greek women knew how to scent their bodies using aromatic oils from lavender, myrrh, or resin mixed with olive oil. This not only kept the body pleasantly scented, but gave the sense of being touched by the goddesses. In the Greek ideal, a beautiful woman had skin like royal jelly, hair black as ebony, lips red as pomegranate, and a scent like Aphrodite's garden. From the purifying bath, skincare with oil and milk, cosmetics to please the gods, hairstyles symbolizing virtue, to garments seemingly tailored by the divine, the entire beauty ritual of ancient Greek women was a sacred ceremony deeply intertwined with religion, ethics, art, and philosophy. They did not beautify themselves merely to attract others, but to attain harmony with the cosmos, so that their bodies would become manifestations of noble ideals, balance, moderation, and eternity. In that world, each woman was a living statue, a reflection of immortal goddesses, and their beauty, like the marble columns of ancient temples, was unshowy yet enduring through time. Pericles, the builder of Athens. In the mid-5th century BCE, Athens was more than just a city-state. It was the brilliant heart of the ancient Greek world. While empires around it were still consumed by warfare and power struggles, Athens entered a miraculous age, a time when art, philosophy, and democracy flourished to unprecedented heights. And at the very centre of this golden era stood a man who wore no crown, sat on no throne, yet wielded a power greater than many kings, Pericles. Pericles was born around 495 BCE in Athens, at a time when Athenian democracy was still forming and evolving. He belonged to the noble Alcmaeonid family, one of the oldest and most influential lineages in Athens. His mother, Agariste, was a descendant of the renowned leader Cleisthenes, widely regarded as the father of Athenian democracy. His father, Xanthippus, was a distinguished politician and general who played a key role in the Greek alliance's victory over the Persians at the Battle of Mycale, 479 BCE. This familial background provided Pericles with a strong political and ideological foundation for his future career. From a young age, Pericles received one of the finest educations available at the time. He studied not only the traditional subjects like Homeric poetry, music, and athletics, all part of Athenian civic education, but was also deeply influenced by philosophy and natural science. One of the most important figures in his intellectual development was the philosopher Anaxagoras, who instilled in him a rational mindset, analytical thinking, and a scientific view of the universe, something rare amid the traditional religious beliefs of the time. Thanks to this influence, Pericles became a politician, not only grounded in practicality, but also guided by reason, idealism, and social progress. Pericles did not launch his political career with fanfare or haste. On the contrary, he was cautious, observant, and deliberate. Around the 470s BCE, he began appearing before the public, delivering persuasive speeches with clarity and calm authority, marking him as a man of intellect, composure, and quiet strength. Before long, he was elected to the office of strategos, a military general, one of the most important positions in Athenian democratic governance. As strategos, he was not only commander of the army but also a policymaker and representative of the people's will in public assemblies, ecclesia. The early phase of Pericles' career was marked by his subtle confrontation with conservative forces and the old aristocratic elite, including the politician Cimon, son of Miltiades. Although he himself came from noble origins, Pericles championed the expansion of power to lower social classes, especially the middle class. This progressive stance gradually earned him the trust and support of the Athenian citizenry, laying the foundation for his nearly 3-decade-long leadership, one of the most glorious periods in ancient Athenian history. By the 460s BCE, the Athenian political stage had become a fierce battleground between the traditional aristocracy and the rising democratic movement. Amid this landscape, Pericles, though aristocratic by birth, emerged as a reform-minded statesman, steadily securing his position in public affairs. His greatest rival at the time was Cimon, a celebrated general known for his victories against the Persians and a staunch representative of the conservative elite. Around 461 BCE, Pericles and the democratic factions skillfully campaigned to have Cimon ostracized, a punishment that exiled a citizen from Athens for 10 years. Cimon's withdrawal paved the way for Pericles to rise rapidly. That same year, he was elected strategos, a military general, a position that not only granted him command over the army, but also gave him significant influence in civil decision-making. Remarkably, Pericles held this position almost continuously for nearly 30 years, an extraordinary feat in the Athenian democracy, where leadership changed frequently. Pericles' career entered its zenith. The period beginning in 461 BCE is often referred to by historians as the Age of Pericles, a time when Athens reached the pinnacle of its power, culture, and intellectual life. With visionary foresight, he implemented a series of foundational reforms aimed at democratizing the political system. One of the most notable was the expansion of citizenship rights and the introduction of paid public service, including for council members and jurors. This allowed even poor citizens to participate in the democratic machinery, breaking the monopoly of the wealthy elite. Additionally, Pericles cleverly consolidated personal power through democratic means. He was frequently re-elected as strategos thanks to the public's trust, and he maintained strong control over the council and the People's Assembly. Under his leadership, Athens became the dominant power in the Delian League, originally formed as a military alliance against Persia, but increasingly used as a vehicle for Athens' own political ambitions. During nearly 3 decades at the helm of Athenian politics, Pericles implemented bold reforms to strengthen democracy, in contrast to the aristocratic system that once dominated Athens' political life. Pericles pursued a model based on greater equality and liberty among citizens, at least within the limits of his time. One of his most controversial reforms was the redefinition of Athenian citizenship. Before Pericles, the concept of Athenian citizen was relatively flexible. However, in 451 BCE, at Pericles' proposal, Athens passed a law requiring that only those born to both an Athenian father and mother would be recognized as full citizens. This law not only aimed to preserve the purity of Athenian identity, but also curtailed the influence of aristocratic families who often married foreigners to expand their power. Yet what truly set Pericles apart in Athenian political history was his policy of paying citizens for public service. Previously, only the wealthy could afford the leisure to participate in political and administrative duties, while the poor had to work to survive. Pericles changed that. He introduced state compensation for citizens who served in the council, juries, and other public offices, thus opening the door for all social classes to participate in governance, a revolutionary democratic advancement. Pericles also sought to strengthen the democratic institutions that had existed since the time of Solon and Cleisthenes. Under his leadership, the Council of 500, Boule, responsible for preparing legislation and supervising state activities, became an essential pillar of Athenian politics. Moreover, the People's Court, Dicasteria, composed of hundreds of citizen judges, was expanded to ensure that the voice of the people held real weight. He also emphasized the use of pebble voting, a common democratic method of the time. White and black pebbles were used to represent approval or disapproval, and were employed in referendums and court verdicts. Most importantly, the entire political strategy of Pericles was geared toward reducing the influence of the aristocracy, those who had long treated Athens as their private domain. To Pericles, Athens belonged to the citizens of Athens, not to a privileged few. Under Pericles' leadership, Athens entered one of the most brilliant periods in all of ancient Greek history, often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens, which spanned most of the 5th century BCE. Over more than 3 decades in power, Pericles not only strengthened democratic institutions, but also established Athens as the foremost centre of culture, philosophy, and the arts in the Greek world. One of his most outstanding contributions was his patronage of the arts and intellectual life. Under his sponsorship, great figures like the sculptor Phidias, the tragedian Sophocles, and the philosopher Socrates found the conditions to flourish. Pericles invited Phidias, one of the greatest master artists, to oversee the reconstruction of the Acropolis, most notably the construction of the Parthenon, which began in 447 BCE. This temple was not only a religious symbol, but also a bold declaration of Athens' supremacy as the centre of Greek civilization. Other important architectural works such as the Propylaea, the grand entrance to the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, and the Temple of Athena Nike were also initiated and developed under Pericles' supervision. Pericles clearly understood the power of image and reputation. After the victory against Persia, he proposed using the enormous financial resources of the Delian League, originally established to defend Greek city-states from Persian threats, to fund Athens' reconstruction. This sparked criticism and opposition from other member states of the League, but Pericles remained firm in his vision of transforming Athens into a leading imperial power. Beyond material achievements, he promoted freedom of thought, laying the foundation for the flourishing of Greek philosophy. In this open intellectual environment, Socrates began expanding his influence, engaging in dialogues in the agora, public square, sowing the first seeds of Western philosophy. Pericles also encouraged large-scale cultural festivals, such as the Great Dionysia, where tragedies and comedies were performed before large public audiences, greatly contributing to the development of ancient Greek theatre. These festivals were not only religious events, but also opportunities for civic pride and national identity to be celebrated. The era of Pericles left behind more than magnificent buildings. It created a lasting spiritual and cultural legacy, a city where art, democracy, and philosophy were intertwined, becoming an ideal model for future civilizations. Pericles was the one who transformed Athens from a powerful city-state into a symbol of human civilization. In 431 BCE, after years of rising tensions and confrontations, the Peloponnesian War officially broke out between the two major powers of ancient Greece, the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta. Long-simmering conflicts, military, political, and economic, had now erupted into full-scale war. Pericles, still holding the position of strategos, general at the time, was the chief architect of Athens' military strategy in the early phase of the war. Unlike Sparta, which had a powerful land-based army, Pericles advocated for a defensive strategy. He proposed withdrawing all residents of rural Attica into the fortified city of Athens, protected by its strong walls. At the same time, he took advantage of Athens' naval superiority to launch attacks on the coastal territories of the enemy. Although this strategy was sound from a military standpoint, it resulted in serious unintended consequences. The concentration of a dense population within the city walls created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. In just the first year of the war, 430 BCE, a devastating plague broke out in Athens. The historian Thucydides, an eyewitness to the events, described an unknown illness characterized by high fever, sore throat, rashes, and gangrene. People died in great numbers, houses became makeshift hospitals, and cemeteries were overwhelmed. Pericles lost both of his sons to the plague, and he himself became infected in 429 BCE. After a prolonged struggle, he died in solitude, leaving Athens in a state of crisis. His death marked a major turning point in the history of the city-state. The golden years came to an end, giving way to a prolonged period of war, division, and decline. Following Pericles' death in 429 BCE due to the plague, Athens entered an era of political instability and gradual decline. No leader who followed could fully inherit his stature or strategic vision. Pericles was not only a brilliant politician, but also the man who shaped the spirit and identity of Athens during its most glorious time, an era often referred to as the Age of Pericles. His greatest legacy was laying the solid foundation of Athenian democracy. Before Pericles, democracy in Athens was still limited by class, wealth, and lineage. Thanks to his reforms, such as the expansion of citizenship, payment for public officials, and the empowerment of the council and the people's courts, political power was more widely distributed, allowing lower classes to genuinely participate in public life. In the arts and philosophy, Pericles was the patron of the most brilliant period of ancient Greek civilization. During his time, great figures like the sculptor Phidias, the tragedian Sophocles, the historian Herodotus, and the philosopher Socrates emerged. The aesthetic values, intellectual thought, and humanist ideals they developed laid the foundations for all Western philosophical and artistic traditions. In architecture and construction, Pericles directed the restoration and rebuilding of Athens after the Persian Wars. Using funds from the Delian League, he oversaw the creation of monumental structures like the Parthenon, the Propylaea, and the Erechtheion, shaping Athens into a city of the gods. These works were not only physical demonstrations of power, but also symbols of the ideas, beliefs, and democratic culture of Athens. More than 2,000 years later, the image of Pericles endures as an ideal figure, a leader of intellect, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the public good. He represents an Athens that was not only militarily powerful or materially wealthy, but a spiritual Athens, a place where freedom, reason, and beauty coexisted. Many thinkers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment looked to Pericles as an ideal model for civilized leadership. The legacy he left behind, from democratic institutions and civic values to artistic and philosophical ideals, continues to influence the modern world. For this reason, history remembers Pericles not just as an extraordinary individual, but as the soul of a civilization. The Parthenon. Standing majestically atop the Acropolis hill in the city of Athens, the Parthenon is one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient world. Not only was it a religious centre dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the patron goddess of the city, but it also served as the ultimate symbol of the golden age of Athenian democracy in the 5th century BCE. In the early 5th century BCE, Athens faced a major existential crisis, the invasion of the Persian Empire. In two successive waves of attacks, 490 BCE and 339 BCE, the city was severely devastated, especially the Acropolis, which housed many sacred temples. After resounding victories over the Persians, particularly in the battles of Salamis 480 BCE and Plataea 479 BCE, Athens not only regained its strength but also rose to a leading position in the ancient Greek world. It was in this context that the statesman Pericles, one of the most distinguished figures in Athenian history, initiated a grand reconstruction program. His goal was not merely to restore what had been destroyed, but to affirm the power, prosperity, and democratic spirit of the Athenian state. At the heart of this ambitious plan stood the Acropolis, regarded as the sacred heart of the city, intimately connected to the goddess Athena. Construction of the Parthenon began in 447 BCE. The temple was designed by two skilled architects, Iktinos and Callicrates, while the decorative sculptures were entrusted to Phidias, one of the greatest sculptors of his time. The structure was built using pure Pentelic marble, symbolizing perfection and eternity. However, the building of the Parthenon was not without controversy. A significant portion of the funding came from the treasury of the Delian League, a military alliance of Greek city-states led by Athens, originally established to defend against the possible return of the Persians. The transfer of funds from the island of Delos to Athens and their use for religious monuments rather than military defence sparked resentment among other member states of the alliance. Some historians, including contemporaries, viewed this act as an abuse of power and an expression of Athenian imperialism. Despite some controversy, the construction of the Parthenon began in 447 BCE and was completed around 432 BCE, taking just 15 years, an impressively short span for a structure of such scale and refinement. It was a key part of the grand reconstruction program for the Acropolis initiated by Pericles, aimed at showcasing the power, wealth, and superior status of Athens in the Greek world following its victory over the Persians. The two chief architects responsible for the design and execution were Iktinos and Callicrates, both renowned masters of the time known for their innovation within the framework of classical Greek architecture, especially in their mastery of the Doric order. They created a building that strictly adhered to classical proportions while skillfully modifying elements to achieve perfect visual harmony, such as subtly curving the base and outer columns to correct natural optical illusions. The sculptural decorations, including the frieze, metopes, tympanums, and especially the colossal statue of Athena housed within the temple, were directed by the legendary sculptor Phidias, a close friend and artistic collaborator of Pericles. Phidias was more than just a craftsman, he was a visionary who embodied the ideals of beauty, spirituality, and aesthetics of Athens' golden age. The Parthenon was not just a masterpiece of art and architecture, it was also a testament to the organisational capability, division of labour, and communal spirit of Athens. From skilled artisans, stonemasons, and sculptors to common labourers, hundreds of individuals worked together to build the Parthenon, a timeless marvel of ancient Greek civilization. The Parthenon, a pinnacle of ancient Greek architecture, was built in the Doric style, known for its simplicity, strength and solemnity. However, the structure also incorporated subtle Ionic elements, reflecting the architect's flexibility and creativity in balancing tradition with aesthetic elegance. Its primary material was Pentelic marble, quarried from Mount Pentelicon near Athens, notable for its pure white colour and soft golden hue under sunlight. The temple measured approximately 69.5 metres in length and 30.9 metres in width, designed in the peripteral style, meaning it was surrounded by a single row of columns on all sides. In total, the Parthenon featured 8 columns at each end and 17 along the sides, all in the Doric style, creating a perfectly balanced layout. These columns were not entirely straight. They were slightly swollen in the middle, entases, to counteract optical distortion and convey strength and harmony. The temple's base and roof were also subtly curved to correct visual perception when viewed from a distance, demonstrating the precision and mathematical sophistication of Greek engineering. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Parthenon is its use of the golden ratio throughout the design, from the height of the columns, the spacing between them, to the dimensions of the central chamber and decorative elements. This gave the temple an ideal aesthetic, both powerful and graceful, expressing the classical spirit of perfection. The sculptural decoration of the Parthenon was equally rich and artistically significant. The interior frieze, a continuous decorative band running inside the temple, depicted the Panathenaic procession, Athens' most important festival, honouring the goddess Athena and the city itself. It was a rare example in temple architecture of depicting real-life events rather than mythological scenes. The tympanums, the triangular pediments at either end of the roof, portrayed mythological scenes such as the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the patronage of Athens on the west pediment, and the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus on the east. These images held symbolic meaning and were closely tied to popular beliefs and religious traditions. Finally, the metopes, the rectangular relief panels between the columns, illustrated heroic battles, such as the struggle between the Lapiths and Centaurs, Greeks and Amazons, and between humans and monsters. These themes symbolise the triumph of reason and order over chaos, a central philosophical ideal of ancient Athens. The statue of Athena Parthenos, one of the greatest and most iconic sculptures of ancient Greece, was proudly housed within the cellar, inner chamber, of the Parthenon. Standing approximately 12 metres tall, Athena Parthenos was crafted in the chryselephantine style, a luxurious combination of ivory, representing skin, and pure gold, used for clothing and ornaments, reflecting the utmost reverence and opulence. Athena was depicted in a commanding stance, wearing a helmet, holding a statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, in her right hand, while her left hand grasped a shield and spear. Carved on the shield were reliefs illustrating the battle between the Greeks and Amazons. Her foot rested on a serpent, symbolising Erichthonius, the demigod hero and legendary founder of Athens. Although the original Athena Parthenos has been lost since antiquity, its legacy still resonates today. Roman replicas and archaeological records have allowed historians to reconstruct an idea of its majestic and divine presence. The statue was not merely a marvel of sculptural technique, it was also an artistic declaration that celebrated Athenian pride and the rational ideals of its democracy. The Parthenon is not only a symbol of ancient Athenian architecture, but also a lasting influence on the entire history of Western architecture. With its harmonious proportions, intricate sculptural detail, and the unique blend of Doric and Ionic styles, the temple became a model for countless buildings, from ancient Roman structures to those of the Renaissance and even modern times. Parliamentary halls, libraries and museums across Europe and the Americas often emulate the Parthenon's layout and column design. However, the fate of the Parthenon has undergone many significant transformations. By the 6th century CE, after Christianity spread through the Byzantine Empire, the Parthenon was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Panagia. This renovation altered parts of its interior and led to the destruction of some original sculptures. In the 15th century, under Ottoman rule, the Parthenon was once again repurposed, this time as a mosque, with the addition of a minaret. The most catastrophic event, however, occurred in 1687, when Venetian forces led by Francesco Morosini attacked Athens. At the time, the Ottomans were using the Parthenon as a gunpowder magazine, a Venetian cannonball struck the temple, causing a massive explosion that destroyed much of its original structure. Today, many of the surviving sculptures, particularly the Elgin marbles, are housed in the British Museum in London. These were removed from Athens in the early 19th century by Lord Elgin, sparking ongoing debates about cultural ownership and the rightful return of Greek heritage. The Parthenon stands as a magnificent embodiment of the unity between art, religion, politics, and philosophy in ancient Athenian civilization. More than just a temple dedicated to Athena, the city's patron goddess, it was a proud statement of Athens' golden age under the leadership of Pericles. Its architecture reflects the Greek aesthetic ideal: proportion, harmony, and order, values aligned with the democratic and civic ideals of 5th century BCE Athens. The Parthenon was also a material symbol of Athens' power and self-confidence following its victory over Persia. It was constructed not only as a place of worship, but as a declaration of the city-state's political and cultural supremacy in the Greek world. Notably, the Delian League's treasury, under Athenian control, was once stored inside the temple, demonstrating the close intertwining of religion and power. Despite centuries of upheaval, being altered, damaged, and contested, the Parthenon endures as a monument to a golden age. Its weathered ruins do not diminish its grandeur, rather, they highlight the resilient legacy of this cultural treasure in the human imagination. The Parthenon remains an eternal testament to the intellect, artistry, and democratic spirit of ancient Athens, a timeless symbol that continues to inspire the world more than 2 millennia later.